Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Alberta Roundtable discussion, February 12th. It's hard to believe that in a couple of weeks we'll be out of this month and spring is on its way. But I'm Shannon Pestun, and I'm super pleased to be your host. Cassandra, I do see on my screen it just says the Diversity Institute, so I just want to make sure that people can see me. If you can give me a quick nod just because I can't see the participants. I can just see our screen. Can you just give me a quick nod? Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. So as I mentioned, I'm Shannon Pestun. Many of you know me as the Senior Advisor of Finance for the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. And I've also been helping the team lead the activities that are happening here in Alberta. And as we start today, of course, I want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from Treaty 7. And I acknowledge Mohkinstsis and the traditional treaty and the oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, of the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, Chiniki, Bearspaw, Goodstoney, and Tsuut'ina Nation. As a proud member of the Otipemisiwak government, I'm a proud member here, and also recognizing that this territory is home to the Otipemisiwak Métis government of the Métis Nation, Calgary Nose Hill Métis District, and Calgary Elbow Métis District. And finally, I acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and non, who live, work, and play on this land and who honor and celebrate this beautiful territory. So thank you all for joining in. I know these conversations that we like to have usually gather our ecosystem to talk about what's happening, who's doing what. But today we wanted to bring in Dr. Wendy Cukier, more of a presentation to the ecosystem to talk about what are we seeing in women's entrepreneurship in Canada and what does it mean for Alberta. I've always said that in Alberta, we have one of the strongest ecosystems, and it's something that I think we should all be proud of, our collaborative ways, the way that we come together in community to accelerate women's entrepreneurship. So today, Dr. Wendy Cukier is going to be talking about the latest State of Women's Entrepreneurship report that came out in 2025. And she's going to highlight some of those persistent barriers that we all acknowledge and know well, but what opportunities are present and the barriers, and how we as an ecosystem can continue to make sure that the work that we're doing is addressing those barriers. So Dr. Cukier will have about a 25-minute presentation of that. Then her and I are going to go into a fireside chat where I've got some more specific questions to ask her. And then we're going to leave 10 minutes for your participation, your questions. So you'll see that we've got a Q&A section in here. So please put your questions in the chat so that we can make sure that we're answering those. So just to briefly introduce our speaker, many of you have seen her. She is probably the most prominent voice on women's entrepreneurship in Canada. I had the privilege of meeting Wendy about 8 years ago when the Government of Canada was establishing its women entrepreneurship strategy. Dr. Cukier is a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Toronto Metropolitan University. She is a co-author of the bestseller Innovation Nation, Canadian Leadership from Java to Jurassic Park, and a leader in creating accessible digital adoption and disruptive technologies with more than 200 articles on diversity, inclusion, and innovation. She is the former Vice President of Research and Innovation at Toronto Metropolitan University and has spearheaded a range of initiatives. So she is the academic director of the Diversity Institute, as well as the academic director and lead of Canada's Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. So Dr. Cukier, that is a mouthful, but it has truly been a pleasure to be witness to the work that you've done in Canada to help us better understand the conditions, the barriers, and the things that we need to do to see change come to fruition. So I will gladly pass it on over to you.
Well, Shannon, thanks so much, and it's really a pleasure to be here. And of course, back at you, you've played such an important role in advancing the interests of women entrepreneurs, not just from an Alberta perspective or an Indigenous perspective, but really making sure that we get real. And your experience in the financial services sector, I think, really puts you in a very strong position to understand not only what it's like to be a woman entrepreneur, but some of the challenges in driving change in large institutions. So really, really, really appreciate your work generally and certainly on behalf of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. So thanks for giving me this opportunity. And I don't know, I'll start with a presentation. I'll try to work through it fairly quickly so that we can have time to really dig in on some of the issues. And of course, um, I am from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples. And some of you will know that the university that I work at changed its name as part of its pathway to truth and reconciliation. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And of course, Shannon has been a key driver in our work for a number of years and serves not just as a special advisor, but has really helped coordinate work in Alberta. So I'll talk a little bit about the context. I'll review some of the findings from the SOE 2025 report and a little bit of data we have on what's going on in Alberta relative to the rest of the ecosystem, some of the results we have of preliminary evaluation and what we see as the strategy to move things forward at this particular point in time, because context really does matter. So the main thing about the Diversity Institute, I think, is really we're big. We have 80 full-time staff. We have national coverage, so we have hubs in 10 communities across the country, mostly at post-secondary institutions, but not exclusively. And in addition to leading the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, we also are the academic research lead for the Future Skills Center. Why is that important? Because it's important because we think that a key enabler for entrepreneurship in Canada generally is related to skills and particularly AI transformation. Um, the other thing that's worth noting is we are part of the Women Entrepreneurship Strategy. And the Women Entrepreneurship Strategy was very large investment by the federal government in financing for women entrepreneurs, strengthening the ecosystem for women entrepreneurs. So some of you will know the Alberta Women's Entrepreneurship or Enterprise Organization, which is part of the Women's Enterprise Organizations of Canada. And there was a big investment in trying to strengthen those organizations that support women's entrepreneurship across the country. And then our portion was really to collect evidence to try to understand what works for whom and advance best practices and provide advice. While most of our focus, we're sort of the B2B piece of this. So we work primarily with partners in the ecosystem, with financial institutions, with federal, provincial, municipal governments, with chambers of commerce, with post-secondary institutions, incubators, accelerators, and so on. But what we found during COVID was there were some real gaps. And so we were asked to step in and help with rolling out support programs, providing advice on how to make sure women were included, and also to simply provide support and networking capabilities. So most of our work is with ecosystem players rather than with women entrepreneurs directly, but because of our work through the Future Skills Center and so on, we do run some large training and capacity building programs as well. I come at this, as I said, from a business perspective, and the thing that I think we have to continually remind everybody of is that small medium enterprises are the engine of Canada's economy. That while there's a lot of focus on large corporations, and of course they're critically important as well, small medium enterprises account for um, more than 90% of employment in the private sector and half the GDP. And yet, very often, when we see things like business roundtables and the captains of industry, um, it's those discussions are dominated by large corporations, which I think is a bit of a problem because what, for example, a large financial institution needs in terms of artificial intelligence, infrastructure, and support, very different from what a five-person small medium enterprise requires. So we do a lot of work with small medium enterprises, generally chambers of commerce and so on, to ensure that their voices and their needs are part of the discussion. And then moving from that, it's also important to recognize that investing in women is not about wokeness or niceness or social justice. It's about business reality. Women own 20% of all businesses across the country, and they're equal partners in about 17%. If you look, for example, at the agriculture sector, many of those businesses are jointly owned because they're family businesses, and family businesses are a big piece of the Canadian economy, again, that often gets overlooked. We also know from the data that majority-owned women SMEs generate more than $90 billion in annual revenues. That's a few years old. It's probably more now, and employ close to 1 million people. Again, in comparison, the financial sector is about 300,000 people. So it isn't to say that financial sector isn't important. Of course it is. But it is to say that if we're not focused on small, medium enterprises, and particularly those owned by women or immigrants punch above their weight in terms of SME ownership, we're really missing out on major opportunities. The other thing that for us is really important is looking at the current environment, the crisis that we're in, what the priorities are in terms of economic growth, international trade, self-sufficiency, and so on. And when we think about Canada Strong, Buying Canadian, and so on, ensuring that women entrepreneurs are part of the value chain, understand the procurement opportunities, and are baked into those solutions. We know there are challenges in the ecosystem, partly because of fragmentation, gaps, and so on. And frankly, because most small businesses, especially now, are trying to keep the lights on and don't have time to go to lots of meetings and spend time trying to figure out where the money is and what the opportunities are. And it's, I think it's interesting because we've never been able to develop any kind of national platform that's really been successful in supporting um, entrepreneurs of any sort, whether it's women or men or whether it's people with, in services or SMEs to overcome some of these challenges, and particularly when we're looking at SMEs that are trying to scale up and attract, for example, investment. It's often like dating before eHarmony and Lavalife, where people go to this event and go to that event, and you may go out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and your perfect match is there Tuesday and Thursday. So I do think that one of the biggest challenges we have is matching people with needs to those who have resources and connections. And that's something we continue to try to do. And that's why meetings like this and the work that Shannon does, just bringing pieces of the ecosystem together, are so very, very important. We also know in the current environment that our best friend is no longer our best friend. And there's a lot of focus on trying to enter new markets. Well, when we look, for example, at the intersectional identities of women entrepreneurs, there are some communities where women are a very high percentage of the entrepreneurs. So if you look at the South Asian community, for example, half of the entrepreneurs are women. If you look at the Black community, it's close to 40%. And when we think about trying to expand internationally and enter new markets, whether it's Asia Pacific, Europe, Africa, South Asia, or whatever, our immigrant diasporas are really, really important. And in Alberta, those are growing communities that can be leveraged. And women in those communities are often more likely to be entrepreneurs than women in other communities. So it's really important to keep tabs on that. We also know that there are huge issues around energy and resilience and I do a lot of work on AI, and one of the biggest impediments to AI growth is going to be access to affordable energy. So lots of challenges in this context. And again, we're just getting ready. We'll be releasing SOE 2026 just in a month or so. And I can tell you that not a lot has changed, but a few things will be new and different. The key things that we've been really reinforcing for a number of years are the structural issues that differentiate women entrepreneurs from men entrepreneurs. Because if you understand those structural issues, that has implications for how you design programs and policies and services. And, Shannon has often talked about how the assumptions that are embedded, for example, in decision-making processes by financial institutions are based on historic data. But a lot of that historic data and where the algorithms came from to evaluate whether to give someone funding or financing or not, that historic data didn't include a lot of women. And so there are fundamental issues that we have to look at in terms of how our assumptions about what risk is, or what capacity is, or where there's potential. We have to make sure that we're not embedding gendered bias. Good example, for instance, and I'll take credit for this. One of the things that WEKH really uncovered wasn't a secret, it's just no one was paying attention to it, is that women are more likely to be self-employed than incorporated. And this is particularly true of Indigenous women who live on reserve. But in general, women entrepreneurs are more likely to be self-employed than incorporated. Now, why? And this has partly to do with the trajectories that women take in becoming entrepreneurs. Often they start with a side gig and it grows into a business. Often women are coming to entrepreneurship at a different stage of their careers than men are. So the traditional notions we have around spin-offs from university and commercialization of technology and all of those things, which tend to, and I say this because I teach entrepreneurship, they tend to dominate the models that we think about, don't really apply for women. Why this is important is, during COVID, a lot of the programs were very much targeting small, medium enterprises. Well, if 81% of women entrepreneurs are self-employed, and some of them with growing concerns and lots of subcontractors, good revenues, and so on. But if they're not incorporated, they were excluded from a lot of the programs that were available, and Indigenous peoples were excluded from a lot of the programs that were available because they tend not to incorporate because of the on-reserve issues. So that one small insight was really important in thinking about how do you, at the one hand, support women entrepreneurs, and on the other hand, manage risk, because you don't want to be giving money to people who aren't going to be able to repay it. So those sorts of structural issues are really important. We also know that men entrepreneurs continue to receive a lot more money than women do. Partly it's they ask for more money, but partly, and we have to again acknowledge these structural differences, they tend to be in the traditional sectors that financial institutions, VCs, and others are accustomed to dealing with. Women are far more likely to be in services sectors where it's sometimes harder to evaluate the IP or the assets or the collateral, for example, that is brought to bear. So, you know, the fact that men get more financing is partly a function of structure. It's partly a function of the sectors that men tend to be in, but it's also a function of biases in the system. And there's lots of evidence that shows, a man and a woman give exactly the same pitch. The man gets asked different questions, all about his aspirations and potential. The woman gets asked questions about her track record, and the man is more likely to get money and more likely to get more money. There's a lot of it's funny because often the assumptions that we make, you hear all the time, women are risk adverse. What does that actually mean? Maybe it means they're prudent and they're a better investment than people who take chances. But we have a lot of embedded biases in the system that tend to disadvantage women, and so we have to be aware of those. We're still waiting. We expect that we will get the 2025 results soon, but we know that women's ownership of small medium enterprises has been steadily growing. Based on quarterly data, it's close to 20% now. We're just waiting for the latest survey results. As I mentioned, we see differences in the sectors that women tend to be in. I'm just going to try to move this out of the way. So you can see women tend to be in retail trade. They tend to be in services. They tend to be in things like accommodation. But look at some of these changes. Like women have almost doubled their representation in agriculture, forestry, fishing and hunting, even mining and oil and gas extraction. They've almost doubled their representation in construction. They've increased their representation in wholesale trade. They've increased their representation even in transportation and warehousing, certainly in professional, scientific, and technical services. So we are seeing women starting to gain more traction in some of those non-traditional sectors that historically they haven't been part of. As I mentioned before as well, it's important to recognize that within different communities, there are higher levels of representation of women. So among Indigenous peoples, remember, overall in Canada, women entrepreneurs own 20% of businesses, but among Indigenous businesses, it's 30%. With racialized people generally, it's about on par, but with Black people, Black women own 40% almost of Black-owned businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So we're seeing that kind of intersectional lens and thinking about different dimensions of identity playing out. The other thing that I think is really interesting is when I started this work, there were big gaps between the propensity of women to export versus men. That's pretty much disappeared. Men and women are just as likely to export, although women are more likely to be in services. And this is kind of interesting, women are much more likely to export outside of the United States than men. We also know that the gap between innovation is diminished. So men and women are just as inclined to innovate. We know, as I mentioned, that majority-owned SMEs are by women are less likely to export to the US and more likely to export to Brazil, to the UK, to China, and to India. Compared to men, there are issues that they face in exporting, and work needs to be done to address that. It's no secret that men still dominate science, technology, engineering, and math, and that plays out in the kinds of businesses that they develop versus women, and also the extent to which women-owned businesses are likely to use technology. It's funny because I remember when the digital supercluster was being set up, and there was a big focus on digital startups. And mostly digital startups were defined as, companies that made technology or provide services. And I always found that funny because if you think of someone like Kendall Jenner, who was one of the first billionaires, her business was based on selling stuff on Shopify. Why would you not consider her a digital entrepreneur? She's using a digital platform. It's just she's adding value in a different way. And so we have seen reconceptualizing what it means to be in a digital business. The other thing, and Shannon's heard me say this before, is the advent of AI is really leveling the playing field because even though there's still gaps between men and women, I often call generative AI the English major's revenge. You don't need a computer science degree. You don't need an engineering degree. In fact, having an English literature degree is probably better for prompt engineering. So we are seeing some of those gaps in terms of the adoption of technology diminish. And I'm a big proponent of responsible AI use. I think AI has immense potential to transform if used for good rather than evil. I already talked about financing. The latest data suggests that, again, people have different views on how they interpret this, but a lot of women are resistant to taking on more debt. They would rather bootstrap their businesses. From the point of view of many financial institutions, that's a bad thing, but maybe not. We also know that women receive less funding and so on. So those issues continue. It is important, though, I think, to recognize, because everyone talks about, oh, Canada, we lack entrepreneurial culture, this, that, whatever. We actually rank very highly in any of the global assessments of women entrepreneurship. Um, we have higher rates of entrepreneurial activity than many other countries, both in terms of startups as well as ownership. When we look at entrepreneurs in Alberta in particular, we can see, as Shannon mentioned, Alberta has the highest percentage of majority-owned businesses that are controlled by women, almost a quarter, compared to the national average, which is around 20%. We also know that overall, when it comes to asking questions about the impact of tariffs, women are slightly less affected in Alberta than other places. This may be a function of structural issues like the businesses that they're in. When we look at the negative impact of tariffs overall, Alberta is higher than other parts of the country, but certainly not the highest. The other thing is when we look at outlook and whether people are optimistic or pessimistic about what is to come, we do see that in Alberta, there's a fairly high level of concern about what the future holds. And again, this may have to do with the sectors that women-owned businesses are in. So in terms of what works, we've done a survey of almost 1,000 entrepreneurs who were part of the WEKH Women Entrepreneurship Strategy. What we found was that a lot of the benefits they cited with respect to participating weren't really tied to funding. This is 16.5% of the people reported that they received new funding in the last 3 months. If you extend that to the last year, it goes up to about 25%. But basically, about a quarter of the people who participated in the Women Entrepreneurship Strategy reported that they received additional funding as a result of their participation. However, a lot indicated that they were more innovative as a result, that they had developed new approaches to business processes, products and services, or sustainable practices. Over half of them talked about gaining social capital and networking and connecting with people. And so it's very interesting when we think about what the impacts of the Women Entrepreneurship Strategy were. There was a big focus on increasing the percentage of women entrepreneurs. We've certainly see an increase, perhaps not to the level that was expected, but what we do see it as having done is really contributed to women's social capital and innovation. And we're working now on specific program evaluations to look at what specific projects did. And we think that procurement is really important. So, as much as we want to make sure that women have access to financing, loans, investment, access to customers is really what it's all about. And so the Maya Inclusive Growth Project is very much focused on navigating procurement. Corrales focuses primarily on ensuring that women are growing in the way that they want to grow, that they're committed to sustainable development goals, creating jobs. And the other groups are focused on specific kinds of goals. So when we think about the way forward, and I'll wrap up very soon, it's important to understand that women entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs generally exist in a very complex ecosystem. And there's no one solution to help strengthen Canada's economy. There's no one solution that fits across the country, across sectors, or for all women. We have to think about the broad context, the stereotypes, the bias, access to funding. We did a study of Indigenous women in tourism in the North. And while when you survey most women and ask them what their principal barrier is, they will say access to financing. Indigenous women in tourism in the North said access to internet. It makes sense, right? A lot of Indigenous women living on reserve don't have access to running water. They certainly don't have access to the high-speed internet that, if you think about it, if you're in the tourism business, is really fundamental to expanding your reach in your markets. We know that there are things that need to happen with respect to all of the players in the ecosystems, business networks, chambers of commerce, incubators and accelerators, certainly colleges and universities. I mean, I teach entrepreneurship. Most of the textbooks we have don't have a single woman entrepreneur in them. With respect to financial institutions, we're big believers in what gets measured gets done, and proponents of the WEKH World Bank initiative, which calls for more transparency around who's getting the funding. It's kind of revolutionized financing in the UK, and there are about 30 countries that have signed up so far. And then, of course, we have to look at individual capacity building, skills, networks, and funding. So we have lots of recommendations about things that are required in order to help women entrepreneurs succeed at the societal level, lots of policy recommendations at the organizational level, principally making sure a rigorous gender and diversity lens is applied to the design, implementation, and evaluation of all your programs. Like, if you don't have women in the pool, is it because of the design of the program, or is it because the program's simply not suitable for them? Those are questions that we have to really ask. And we're certainly preoccupied with AI transformation and how to drive that forward. We also need to recognize that individual women entrepreneurs are different very often than each other, but there are also certain trends that we see with women that are different than the overall trends we see with men in terms of what they want, what they need, and so on. And this came out very clearly in COVID, where peer mentoring and connection were really, really important for keeping women going, where most women were navigating unpaid work commitments, whether it was caring for older parents or children or whatever, with trying to grow their businesses. And so any kind of supports around childcare and so on become really, really fundamental. We know in dealing with low income women, for example, if you don't have childcare, when you're running your training programs, you're going to miss out on a lot of people who could really benefit. So, really thinking about what it is women need and what it is women want. Some women don't want to be segregated. Women who are in AI, women who are in tech, women who are in infrastructure, they want to be part of the big initiatives. They don't necessarily want a women in AI network, they want to be part of the AI network. Women who are looking for venture capital, some of them want to work with other women, some of them just want access to VCs. So we really need to not impose our assumptions on what women want or need. And thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to having a further discussion.
Thank you, Wendy. One of the things that I always appreciate is the lens that you put on the ecosystem and for showing us how complex that ecosystem is from a societal perspective to what we can do organizationally and then as individuals. I wanted to remind everyone that we do have opportunities for Q&A. So if you do have those questions, please put them in the chat. Wendy, I just want to go into a little fireside chat with you to kind of just deepen the conversation on some of the things that you touched on. And I think one of the most important questions from my perspective in this is when we think about the importance of an ecosystem, we talk about collaboration. And as I mentioned at the top of this call, we have an incredibly collaborative ecosystem here in Alberta. We see financial institutions partnering with the developmental lenders, thinking about how government gets involved, thinking about the grassroots organizations. But from your perspective and some of the research and being on the front lines of seeing what works and what doesn't, what does a high performing, inclusive women's entrepreneurship ecosystem look like for you? And as practitioners who are in the field and working with women entrepreneurs, like what advice do you have around what it means for us as an ecosystem to be as high performing and as impactful as we can be?
It's a really good question, and I think one of the things I've learned in working on innovation and entrepreneurship for a number of years is that often often people think, some people, not anyone in Alberta, I know, but people think, oh, the Toronto Waterloo Nexus is the core of entrepreneurship in the country and. The fact is, in a province like Ontario, it is brutal, brutal, trying to get people around a table to collaborate, to cooperate, to move in the same direction because it's too big. Everyone's pulling in different ways, etc. One of the things Alberta has going for it is scale. Like the fact that in Calgary you can actually get everybody around a table physically or virtually to talk about what's going on in the ecosystem and what's needed. The fact that you can have a round table that has the financial institutions, the VCs and business intermediaries and so on and so forth is a real advantage because the biggest killer in my view of ecosystems is fragmentation. And that isn't to say that everybody does the same thing. I'm a big believer in this notion that it is important to have targeted funding for women without question. But it's equally important to look at all of the other programs that are there for entrepreneurs generally and make sure that we ask ourselves the questions, can women access this money or this funding or this support? Are there barriers? Are we defining entrepreneurship in a way that is excluding women? So I think the number one thing is trying to navigate that fragmentation. And as you said at the outset, pull together, make sure people know what the pieces are. It's like people with pieces of an elephant thinking it's this thing versus that thing. And I think it's making sure you've got a big picture of what the elephant is and who's doing what is number one. Supporting navigation. One of the things that I learned, for example, is we do, and I'm speaking about Ontario specifically, but I was doing a presentation at one of the Black women entrepreneurship things and on business plans, or I don't know what it was. And one of the women put in the chat, this is the third time I'm taking the course. And I thought, like, how is that possible, right? Why would you take a course three times? I'm not that interesting. There's no pass or fail. And what I realized was two things. One is in some communities, confidence building is the name of the game, right? Just getting someone's confidence up to the level where they will identify themselves as an entrepreneur is one piece of it. But the second thing, which is the bad thing, is we don't have a good mechanism for handing people off. Like you got a $5,000 grant for this, you got a developmental loan for that. You've met your milestones. Where do you go next? And so that wayfinding is another aspect of fragmentation because the players in the ecosystem may think that that's really obvious. But if you put yourself in the position of the entrepreneurs, often they don't know where to go from this place to that place. And we see that with the incubator networks, for example, where someone will go to one incubator accelerator, they finish the program, then where do they go next? Because what we really want to avoid is any entrepreneur who's just kind of grant surfing, right? I got
Mm,
my $5,000 grant here. Now I'm going to go here for five. Like if your business is surviving only on grants,
mm,
if you don't have revenue, if you don't have financing, maybe it's not a business, right? And the only way you can make those determinations is if you have not only the players in the ecosystem working together, but you have clear articulation about where you start, where you go next, and so on. And this differs by industry, right? So if you're a startup in the tech sector, your pathway is likely to be different. But I do think that a lot of times we in the ecosystem think that we can map it out and we don't put ourselves in the position of the people who are trying to navigate through it. So I think that's the second thing. I think the third thing is recognizing that women entrepreneurs are core to your economy, even more so in Alberta than in other parts of the country. Like they're 25% of business ownership. Every single every single business roundtable should have women at it, right? So of course it's important to have a women in the economy or a women in entrepreneurship roundtable and to strengthen those specialized venues. But getting out of the mindset that women entrepreneurs are a separate thing and need to be treated separately, I think is critically important as well. We need to mainstream the commitments around women entrepreneurs. I think the fourth thing for me, and City of Calgary does this that's a gendered word. City of Calgary does this very well, is looking at procurement as an instrument to support entrepreneurs. So instead of just thinking about financing or grants or whatever, think about how you're spending money and how you can ensure that some of that money goes to women. Now, it may not be that women are going to be your tier one providers, but they may be the tier two or tier three providers that work with the tier one providers. And of course, this is also important with Indigenous people. So thinking about your procurement as a really important lever and your investments in R&D as a really important lever rather than just thinking, oh, we need a fund that's called women entrepreneurship. And then I think, what gets measured gets done. So really setting targets and tracking where you are is important. And the final thing is challenging our assumptions about what an entrepreneur is. One of the things that I find really funny, and I was the vice president of research and innovation. I helped set up the digital media zone. I helped grow the Incubate, Innovate Network of Canada, and the Hunter hub is part of that. All the incubators and accelerators, but we tend to associate entrepreneurship with the tech sector, right? Even though the tech sector is such a small percentage of entrepreneurship. And one of the things that stuck in my mind that I just put out there for you is I was on a panel with the British Beauty Council, and one of the presenters said, health and beauty has faster growth rates, higher margins, lower failure rates, and more export potential than tech. And yet, as I said, I guess it's Kylie Jenner, not Kendall Jenner. But as I said, we often don't think of people in health and beauty or culture or some of these other sectors as actually being entrepreneurs. And in fact, they have lots of economic potential as well.
Thank you for that, Wendy. I want to also ask a question because I think a lot of us, particularly in Alberta, our climate is around EDI right now is a tricky landscape for a lot of us who are working in this space. And I think there's a lot of us who are saying, like, what is the future of women's entrepreneurship? Like, how do we continue to ensure that these conversations are heard, that our voice of advocacy is there? What are your thoughts around how we strengthen the advocacy and the voice of women's entrepreneurship to ensure that in a challenging climate around EDI, that we don't lose sight of the importance of this?
Yeah, and for me, I have always found the debate or the suggestion that merit is opposed to equity doesn't make any sense to me because if you don't embrace equity in a country where half the population are women, and we make 75% of the purchasing decisions. 25% of the population is immigrants, 25% of the population is racialized, 27% of the population identifies as having a disability, and probably, 10% or whatever identifies as Indigenous or as 2S LGBTQ plus. Add that up. And if you exclude those people, you are fishing in a very little pond, whether we're looking at access to talent or markets or ideas or innovation. So for me, I always just come back to marketing 101. It's your market segments. If women own a quarter of the businesses in Alberta, you ignore them, and they probably own another 15% where they're shared, partnerships. If you ignore them, you do so at your peril, right? It's to me trying to depoliticize it and really come back to the foundations of what I would call the business case is so important. We see lots of businesses saying this is not about political correctness. This is not about wokeness. This is about business. This is about markets. This is about talent. This is about innovation. The end is the argument that I stick to as opposed to getting drawn into what I would consider to be more ideological debates that I think are not productive.
Thank you, Wendy. I've got a question from Alla. Alla is the women entrepreneur lead over at TD. So Alla leads the Women in Enterprise for the region here of Alberta. Alla, I'm going to read your question, but to the rest of our community, I am really curious to know, where do you feel like you need more research, more knowledge? I just want to get a temperature check to say what information would help you advance your organization and the work that you're doing. Feel free to put that in the Q&A chat. But Alla's question is, Wendy, Where do you think lenders have the greatest opportunity to evolve? So maybe that's in credit decisions through underwriting, relationship building, product design to close the funding gap for women entrepreneurs. And Al is also saying, and as a follow-up, while we wait for the evolution, what should lenders be doing differently to better support women-owned businesses while navigating systems that weren't built with them in mind? Thank you,
You
Al,
know,
for your
it's
question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And we just did a little project for TD, um, looking at the perspectives of women with respect to financial institutions. And so what I would say for lenders, and of course Shannon comes out of the sector, so she's she can certainly weigh in on this as well. But what I would say is to really confront the fact that your traditional five C's, which I always forget, but credit, collateral, character,
Capacity.
capital,
Yeah, yeah, you got it. You got it, Wendy.
something, one more, were based on certain historic patterns. And I'll give you what I think is a good example, maybe not. I was talking to the Dean of Engineering, and he said, "Oh, we've had to lower our standards to increase the percentage of women in our program." And I said, "Oh, yeah. And how's that working for you?" And he said, "Well, it's funny because when they come into the program, they do better than the men, right?" So what does that tell you? To me, that says the problem is not with the women. The problem is with your sorting mechanisms and your selection. Because if you let women into the program who you think are lower quality, but then they perform better than the men, what that tells me is that your selection criteria are not aligned with what you need for success. And I believe that that principle also applies to the decisions around funding. And of course, I know, Shannon, when you were at ATB, you did some experiments around crowdfunding. I know there are models like community-based decision making through Corrales, things like that. I do think um, that the financial institutions need to come together and really question some of their fundamental assumptions. Now, what I hear all the time is, "Oh, we can't, the office of the superintendent of financial institutions won't let us do that, won't let us do that." My my idea was, okay, so you can't do this through your existing mechanisms. If all of the big banks or the mid-sized financial institutions or something, just put some money in a pot, from their corporate social responsibility donation stuff where they hand out lots of money. We put it in a pot and we design some experiments. What happens if you apply community-based decisions to who gets loans? What happens if you don't jack up the interest rates so you actually precipitate a crisis because you say someone is high risk, so you charge them more interest, so they're not going to be able to repay the loan? What if we experimented with new models, like in some countries they call them GOANs. They're kind of part grant, part loan, so part of it is forgivable. What if we just experimented and challenged some of the assumptions that currently drive the system? Because my expectation is that we would find that the decision-making processes around who gets financing are not well-founded, and that you're missing opportunities to grow funding. So I think that for me is one of the things, is really to challenge some of the assumptions around how you're making decisions. And then I think the other thing is to really dive in around, um, and there was one financial institution that wanted us to do a secret shopper experiment. We couldn't do it because of the ethics reviews. But I remember one occasion where I got a call from someone who said, she wanted me to use my connections to deal with a crisis. Now, this was a mortgage. It wasn't business, but it's not unrelated. A young woman was negotiating a mortgage. Her mother gave her $25,000 and she was trying to use it to pay her down payment or whatever. the bank refused to accept it, even though it was a transfer, because they didn't know where it had come from. And she was Black. I am quite certain if I walked into my bank with paper bags full of $1 bills and quarters, they would not bat an eyelash. They would take the money and pay it. So, what I'm saying is, I think that all institutions, and I say this about universities as well, have to really look at what they're doing because any of the surveys that we do suggest that women have very different experiences than men in dealing with financial institutions. They're not all bad, but a lot of them have had very negative experiences with people who just don't know better. And so really grappling with some of that, I think is super important. And I think the third thing is the idea of wraparound support. So not just giving financial, not just, giving loans, but also providing support or partnering with organizations that can provide support in order to make sure that the business that you are giving the loan to is well positioned to do what it needs to do to both grow and pay back the loan.
We've got one last question and then I'm going to close it up. I'm going to give you 1 minute for this answer, Wendy. I'm sorry, but we're at time. But Milena Radakovic, who we know as our We Do ambassador for Canada, is doing some great work here to drive Women's Entrepreneurship Day forward, has said, I have a few people who are asking about grants for women. Where is the best place that you would recommend for women in business to apply for those loans? And maybe it's a chat answer that might be easier as well. But I'll give you 1 minute for that question. I will say Pocketed is a really good one. Just Milena, that's a really great source. If anyone else wants to put in the chat, let's use our collective wisdom as well on that one.
Yeah, I think it's more than 1 minute. So let's just maybe as follow-up, Shannon, you can provide my slides and we
Yeah.
can provide some links. And the only thing I wanted to mention is again to encourage everyone on the call who is in a position to think about their procurement policies. Some of the big financial institutions are thinking about procurement, but everybody should be customers of women entrepreneurs, regardless of what sector they're in.
Well, Wendy, thank you. I mean, we never have enough time for the questions, but thank you to those who put your questions in the chat. And again, research plays such an important role. It's giving us that evidence so that we can put into practice, or but not just put into practice, but we can actually start doing the actions that are addressing the recommendations in the research. So I encourage everyone to look at the State of Women's Entrepreneurship report. Wendy's alluded to the fact that a new one is coming, so it's always going to keep us top of mind and keep us on track with what needs to happen. Wendy, I thank you. I thank everybody from our ecosystem. I know we've had a very short time together here today. So know that you can always reach out to Wendy or to myself. We're also going to record this and send this out. But as always, I am grateful to everyone for coming and hearing and your collaboration and the ways that we contribute to not just each other and our organizations, but the wider work that we're doing to support women entrepreneurs. So, Dr. Wendy Cukier, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Shannon.